Everyone, hello. I'm sick, and I'm not very happy about that. So I'm just going to read everyone a good night story, and then it's bedtime. The story's called Wood, and it's by Robert Aickman, who is very good and very creepy, and I haven't read to the end of this story, so I don't know what happens. I hope you enjoy it. So my niece, Eleanor, has given me one of those weather houses where the woman comes out when it is likely to be fine and the man when it is going to rain. I did not think they were made anymore. There is something about them that not many people know, at least nowadays. It is this, that just as dowsing can be used to trace many other things than water, which of course makes water divining quite the wrong name for it, so these little weather houses, or some of them, can be attuned to foretell more things than the merely literal state of the heavens. It is an odd story of which I am reminded by this, and until now I had not cared to make a note of it. There is always the risk of a written record coming into the wrong hands, and so perhaps reaching the eyes or ears of the person described. The people described. Moreover, I was always very uncertain how far I could depend upon my own impressions of what happened. And naturally I am even less confident now, nearly 20 years later. Also, one is superstitious about seeming to give a new life by writing about it to something which has frightened one. The curious business about Munn and his wife, whatever I thought about the reality of it, even at the time, certainly frightened me so much that I was the last person to be surprised by what happened to them in the end. But old pal and his wife are dead now too. So, here goes. I suppose that if anyone at all reads what I am writing, it is more likely than not to be a stranger. A few sentences about myself had, therefore, better come first. I served my articles as an architect in the days when that was how one learned a profession, by working at a practical and immediate problems from the first, instead of merely listening to lectures and doing exercises. And for several years I worked as an architect assistant in a good office, doing well and having every prospect of starting in practice on my own. The tone was set in those days by architects such as Ernest George, and there seemed an unlimited number of costly country houses being built, pleasant work for all who had the social knack of getting it, which did not seem very difficult as I look back on it. But then came the war, the first one, and the real one. The greatest mistake mankind ever made, in my opinion, but curiously enough, one out of which I myself did quite well, at least in a sense, well. Before it was over, and to my considerable surprise, I found myself a lieutenant colonel, the very much of the wartime kind, not the real thing, as I knew perfectly well. But then in the very last month, more or less when Wilfred Owen was killed, if I have it right, I was not killed, but badly knocked out, since I have never been quite right in any way, even though I made a good recovery and a remarkably swift one. Of course, I had always intended to go back into architecture, but I never quite did. There were several factors. One was that I began to receive a pension, which at first seemed fairly good. Enough, anyway, to save one from having to rush at things and to give one time to think. Another, and much more important, was that the profession had completely changed. We were fast on the way to the state of affairs when the word art was seldom mentioned, still less the word beauty. It is odd that the busy, slave-driving old offices, always with several pupils, had much to say about art and beauty. Too much, many of the pupils thought, while these new schools of architecture lead to nothing but, for example, the buildings you can see beside and around the Festival Hall in London. The third thing was that I never succeeded in marrying and thus taking on a new incentive. The war seemed to do something to me there, or perhaps it was mainly my experiences at the end of the war. But what settled things at first was that I was offered the job of editing a series of architectural lives. I'd always been interested in the actual lives and careers of the architects of history, and the work carried me away completely for a longish time. I was enabled to travel in a modest way, though there again I could not have paid for a wife to travel with me, and I was in a position to appoint myself as the author of 2 or 3 of the books. I did so, and these books proved to be among the most successful of the series, for what that meant. When I was in my mid-40s, I bought an old cottage outside this Suffolk village, without clearly realizing that East Anglia is preeminently the part of England to which unattached and unattachable males, with tiny but comparatively secure incomes, tend to drift. They settle there on the outskirts of villages, and I must admit seem often to live on forever, though no one quite knows what they do all day. Edward Fitzgerald is the archetype and patron of us all, though, speaking for myself, I have so far managed to keep my hands off the local fishing lads. But then Fitzgerald was a genius, even though an underproductive one. I, no genius, managed to have many affairs of the more ordinary kind, mainly, indeed, with married women. It does not seem a thing one should proclaim, but it is no joke being a married woman in East Anglia, if the woman has the smallest imagination. I am, therefore, unabashed. That odd man, Munn, on the other hand, seemed, during the first years I knew him, to be genuinely uninterested in women. Of course, I did not know him really well, then or ever, and one can be utterly mistaken in such assessments. Still, many English males are genuinely unconcerned about women, without the need for them, especially after the age of 30 or so. Munn struck me in those days as one who, instead of embracing a woman, embraced a grievance. Unlike most people with entrenched grievances, he was as reticent about the details as one normally is, or as one should be, about the details of a love relationship. He had been employed in the Inland Revenue, and there had been some trouble of some kind, though it was hard to guess what, because he had emerged with a small allowance, upon which, like me, he lived. In his case, in rooms above the village post office. Possibly he unearthed some corruption or other and had to be sacked and silenced. If Munn had been still in the employ of the tax people, instead of on bad terms with them, I could never have known him, even as an acquaintance. Because, say what they will, I cannot accept that any kind of gentleman will, under any circumstances, make a career of prying into the private affairs of others and then mulcting them, commonly to the point of spoiling and destroying their entire lives and those of their families. And supplemented his allowance, which comically enough was tax-free, by making funny little figures out of straw and brass wire, which were offered for sale in the post office below under the name of daffies. It was an unusual occupation for a middle-aged man, but I mention it because it had a faint and obscure bearing upon what happened in the future. Meanwhile, the figures, though often quite clumsy, seemed to sell remarkably well, not only to passing motorists, of whom, from other points of view, there were soon far too many, needless to say, but even to the villagers and rustics, apparently from other villages. Sometimes one of our locals, having bought one of Munn's straw figures, would later buy another. Perhaps the first figure had by then worn out, but at least it proved that Munn was meeting a demand, always the great thing in the world, we are told. I have described the figures as little, and most of them were, but always on view were a few larger ones, some 2 or 3 feet high. Naturally, these cost more, and it was the smaller, cheaper figures that most of the motorists went for, and that must have provided most of the turnover, again, as is usual in commerce. Munn had taken up residence in the village before I arrived, and at first all I knew of him was his tweedy figure, toddling about and sometimes bidding me good day. His tweeds were very hairy indeed, and more than usually shapeless. One almost felt that he made his suits himself, as well as the straw figures, and perhaps wove the hirsute fabric also. He had profuse white hair under a scarecrow hat, a nose like a reversed peg for that same hat, and a darkly red face, which made one think neither of drink nor of exposure to the elements, neither of sickness nor of shyness. It struck one simply as how he was made, how he was coloured, several shades too red. Some are made too tall, and others too dwarfish. It was at one of the village inns, I refuse to employ the word pub, that I first exchanged more words with Munn than the time of day. I remember the occasion very well, but I have little recollection of what we said then, or indeed at most of our subsequent encounters. Of course, he hinted at his troubles, and I at mine, but were neither of us, perhaps to a fault, involved or much interested in what is called the life of the village, so that we undoubtedly ranged over wider fields. The newspapers, the world, and man's future, though, as I have said, seldom women's. Munn seemed another who did not quite know what next to do in life, or even to aim at doing. He, too, was, more than anything else, marking time. The main thing we had in common was exile. All the remaining days of our lives seemed to drop upon us like dried-out snowflakes, or like daily leaves from the dead calendar of a past and forgotten year. It was as well that the Marxists did not catch and roast us. Life has become more rigorous than it was then, though it is likely to become more rigorous still. And yet, I think I had been talking in a sketchy way to Munn, on and off, and every now and then, for as long as 3 or 4 years, when one morning, as I was on my way to something rather private, and was less than usually open to distraction, he hailed me from across the street and asked if I would look in at his place for a drink that same evening. I can see him as he did it in my mind's eye quite clearly. The white shutters across Gab the butcher's window were behind him in the late autumn sunshine, so that it must presumably have been early closing day or the Sabbaths. After all, it was a rather historic moment. I had never before been invited to enter the rooms above the post office, which at the time I was about to undertake would be completed long before evening, so I accepted for 6:30. Munn proved to have several rooms, quite a suite, reached by his own stair from the street, and in general seemed to be better accommodated than I had supposed, even though the trappings plainly appertained to a furnished apartment. All that looked personal was a mill for making the straw figures. As usual with Munn, the device looked as if he had made it himself, out of rough old planks, thick long nails, and bright steel edges, very sharp by the look of them. The contraption stood in a corner of the living room, with a bale of straw stuck away behind it, and straw ends all over the carpet, beneath and around it. Of course, always dry, or no doubt there would have been complaints from the sub-postmistress, Mrs. Hextable, below. There were also 2 or 3 of the figures lying about in various stages of completion. "My eke out of income," said Munn, entering the room behind me and watching my gaze. He crossed to the machine and gave it a hard kick in the midriff, so that the bright cutting wheel spun round like a flying saucer. "And I wish His Majesty's bloody commissioners were beneath it," added Munn. "Now sit yourself down," he went on, and without consulting me, mixed a whisky that was far stronger than I normally liked or like, or than he had observed me drink at the inn, supposing that he ever took in such things. "I propose to ask you a favour." He had provided himself with an even stronger whisky than mine. He gave me the impression of a man who so feared to find himself weak that he had both hands on the bull's horns almost before the animal had entered the field, so to speak. "I'm getting married, and I want you to be my best man." I must admit I had feared that it was going to be something to do with money. "I expect I can manage that," I replied, "though it's something I've never done." "At our age one feels such a fool having to ask," said Munn. I saw that his hands were shaking. "I have always felt that the plural possessive is a case that should be used with caution, but all I said was, 'Where will it be? And who is she? And congratulations, too, of course.' "It's only in the next county, in fact, just over the border." Munn expressed it a trifle histrionically, but of course there is an enormous difference between Suffolk and Norfolk, and between both and North Essex. "I shall be hiring a motor," Munn continued, staring at me as if the availability of private transport might make all the difference. "I shall be delighted to do everything I can," I said, taking a goodish pull on Munn's whisky. "In fact, I shall be honoured." Munn looked a shade doubtful about that, as well he might, but he was wonderfully relieved, and almost gulped as he said, "Thank you very much. I shall never forget it. I may be able to do the same for you one day." "Who knows?" I responded, as the whisky began to rise within me. "Would Saturday of the week after next suit you?" Munn really seemed to imply that if it would not, the day could be changed. "Perfectly," I replied, though almost completely at random. "I was afraid it might not. Unfortunately, it has to be on a Saturday or a Sunday, or my future wife's people couldn't get to it." "I quite understand. He's a very busy man, and his wife is closely involved in what they do." It seemed that I was meant to take that up, even though, as will be noticed, I had not yet even learned the bride's name. "And what is that?" I inquired politely. "It's something I think you ought to know. That's why I raised the matter," said Munn. I nodded. "It's a little hard to talk about," said Munn, looking at the floor. "It's the kind of thing that makes people giggle a bit." Munn drew on himself again and gazed at me. "I don't really mind if you do giggle. I couldn't possibly blame you." "I shall do nothing of the kind," I rejoined. But Munn still beat about the bush. "You know that story of Maurice Baring's, or is it a play?" "I am not sure I do." Maurice Baring had, after all, written an enormous amount, even by the date we had then reached. "A young man tells a girl he has a secret, and he simply must confide in her before she marries him. She wears black and blue that, no matter what it may be, she will love him. She swears black and blue that no matter what it may be, she will love him as much as ever. In the end, he discloses that he's the hangman, and she sheers off." "No," I said. "I can't recall having come upon that." "My future father-in-law is an undertaker," said Munn. "Not the hangman. Just the undertaker." "I shouldn't let that worry you. Indeed, I've always understood it's a most lucrative trade. Whatever happens in the world, the demand's still there. Indeed, as things get worse, it often increases." "What a good chap you are!" exclaimed Munn, refilling my glass. "When I told my brother, he laughed at first and then began to be very wary. Of course, he's been a married man for more than 20 years. Really settled, is Rodney. But it was just the same with 3 other men I spoke to about it." "It doesn't worry me," I asserted. It was hardly possible to say anything else, though what I had said was not the exact truth. "It's just the 2 of them do the whole thing," Munn continued. "He was a merchant navy carpenter or something like that to begin with, and then began to specialize. She does the laying out as well as any professional, embalming, for example, though of course there's no great demand for that in rural England. All the same, she has an embalmer's full certificate. It's rather comic, really. It hangs on their wall. It's one of the first things you see. Someone has to do those things," I said. "Yes," said Munn. "And it's quite surprising how clean and calm it all is when you get close to it. Clean and calm are the words that have stayed in my mind all the way through." I inquired no further, though I dare say it was obvious enough that Munn wanted to go on talking around the discouraging topic. For my part, I've always been a conventional enough person, and drink or no drink, I was beginning very clearly to understand why the topic is half taboo. I said I was sorry, but then it was time I went, and Munn said he would call for me in the hired motor at 8 a.m. on the following Saturday week. Did I mind it being so early? Munn was once more drawing himself together, but I was past minding almost anything as long as this absurd ceremony could be decently put into the past and, as far as I was concerned, buried there. I said I would look for a booklet upon the duties of a best man, but Munn said quite earnestly that it wouldn't be necessary. In all the circumstances, I never expected to receive one of those smooth cards that announce future weddings. And this was as well, because none came. Before the day dawned, I saw Munn 2 or 3 times stumbling about the village. After all, it was not a large village, and an imminent bridegroom could hardly live as a recluse. I thought it best to make no approach, and this was clearly right, because Munn made no approach to me, except that once, when we were far enough apart and unmistakably going in different directions, he winked at me. It seemed plain that Munn did not want his future plans to be generally discussed, so I said nothing about the matter to anyone. After a day or 2, however, I recollected that a best man is prepared to make a presentation of some sort to the bride. The answer to that was simpler than might be expected. I have a rule that when a gift is required, I give a year's membership, or occasionally longer, of a society which admits one free of charge to a number of buildings of diverse architectural interest. The general public has to pay for admission in every case, and the list of structures includes several important ones to which the general public is not admitted at all. I did reflect that it might not be an absolutely ideal gift for a young girl, but there was no evidence that Munn's intended was a young girl. I knew nothing about her. I had not inquired, because I had little doubt that if Munn had wanted me to know at that stage, he would have told me. There was also the question of gifts to the bridesmaids. I dealt with it by assuming there would be no bridesmaids. I was right about that, but for some reason, no doubt the infrequency of weddings in my life, it had never occurred to me that there might not even be a church. I simply couldn't face all that white stuff and slobbering about, said Munn to me in the car. I'm sure you'll agree it's not the thing for chaps of our age. So we were making towards a small country town with a convenient registry office. I shall not give a name to the town, because marriage is an institution so delicate that all in any way concerned are very touchy on the subject, and prone to seek legal redress for any possible dubiety or even comment. At the time, I wondered whether Munn was not perhaps a divorced man, or even a potential bigamist. It was the kind of thing that the course of events tended to bring to one's mind, but I have absolutely no reason to think there was any truth in either hypothesis. In the car, however, Munn did let fall his bride's family name. It was Pell. In East Anglia, a gypsy name, though less eminent in that way than Mace. I did not remark upon these facts to Munn. He was now referring to the bride herself as Vi. Munn struck me as being less uneasy than I had expected. I observed that he had not bought new clothes for the occasion, but was in his usual shapeless tweeds. I myself was at least wearing a dark suit. I touched my pocket containing the membership of the society I have mentioned, which I had sealed in an envelope. Sealed, I mean, with scarlet sealing wax. I was far from sure what would be the best moment to hand it over. I should have to wait upon events. The distance was not all that great, and we managed to arrive before the registry office was even open. There were, in fact, 6 or 7 minutes to go. I found that this was the sort of thing that could be counted upon, and concentrated upon the idea that my duties must soon be all over. At least we had the car to wait in, which was fortunate, as it had begun to rain. The car was of moderate size only, and I wondered how many there would be for the return trip. The young driver began to nod to passers-by he knew. Munn had fallen silent. By way of conversation, I inquired how he and his bride had met. She came into the post office in like my straw daffies. She told Mrs. Hextable that she would like to meet me. She thought we had interests in common. Mrs. Hextable came up and brought me down, and so it proved to be. You mean you did find you had a lot in common? So it seemed. I must admit that I'd been keeping half an eye open for a wife for some time. You may not believe that. I was feeling more and more that I couldn't let my whole life be ruined by the swinish way I was treated. Of course I believe you, and I'm quite sure you're right, I said firmly, and I very sincerely hope you'll be very happy. I felt quite warm about it. Old Pell says he's going to build us a house, remarked Munn. I managed to avoid any facetious reference to an abode which would last till doomsday. Even so, Munn was blushing slightly. My God, I cried, what about the ring? It was the first time I had thought of it. I was behaving like the best man in a pantomime, but then, of course, one so often does behave like a character in a pantomime. It's all right, said Munn. Here it is. He handed over a tiny grey box from his jacket pocket. Isn't it rather small? She's a small girl. At that point, one of the big office doors opened and a clerk emerged. Is either of you Mr. Munn? I am, said Munn. The registrar's waiting for you. The bride is inside already with her family. I cannot recall that I ever learned how they had managed to achieve this. Professional influence, no doubt. The windows of the room in which the ceremony was to take place were in need of cleaning. Perhaps they were unusually difficult to reach, as they were very high in the walls. The grime on the panes and the increasing rainfall made things very dim, and somewhat obscured my first view of the Pell family. My main family was that they were indeed very small. Small, smooth, and round was the impression they all left with me. Miss Pell, a little taller than her gnome-like parents, though only a trifle, was a pretty, round-faced, round-eyed girl, arrayed in bright colours, a selection of them. She had very blue eyes, and very pink cheeks, and very yellow hair, which stuck up sturdily all over her head, rather in the manner of Munn's own white tangle. She was talking as we entered the room, in a noticeably sharp, even metallic voice. There was something stocky and assured in her whole demeanour, which I must admit did not attract me. And from pretty well the first instant I was in no doubt at all that it was she who had carried off Munn, rather than he who had captured her. Why she should wish to do that was another matter, but no affair of mine, and rather glad I was to be unimplicated. Munn's marriage, hitherto partly comic, partly pathetic, became for me, as I entered that registry office, partly disagreeable, as I should add that Mr. Pell was dressed in a well-fitted black suit, and little Mrs. Pell in a tight dress of deepest purple. Happy to meet you, said Mr. Pell. One could simply not exclude the sinister overtones of such a greeting from one's mind, absurd though it is to say so. I simpered. I often think the best man is the key to the whole wedding, continued Mr. Pell. Even that implausible compliment added to my uneasiness, lacking as I was in all experience of the tasks required. Moreover, Mr. Pell had a grating voice, compulsive antecedent of his daughter's. "How do you like the bride's clothes?" inquired Mrs. Pell. "Doesn't she look gay? Don't you think Leonard's lucky to get her?" I had forgotten that Mun's name was Leonard. Christian names were not used among men in the present casual way, and had to grope in my mind for what she meant. "She looks lovely," I said. "You'll be able to kiss her in a few minutes, you know. It's the best man's privilege." I shan't forget. But the registrar was awaiting us with some impatience, especially as he had a bad cold. The rubric was minimal, and that only a few minutes had seemingly passed, before he was saying, "And I hope you'll be very happy," and moving back to the fire that was smoking away in his private room. I passed across the ring at the right moment, and at so spare a solemnization had little other commitment. We all signed the register, including the driver of the car. There had been no one else present, except the registrar's clerk, who served unobtrusively. The Pells were cackling away. The verb was unavoidable, though of course voices do run in families, as do handwriting and faiths. And now had come the time for me to kiss Vi. Her cheek, to which I confined myself, struck me as hard and chilly, but the bride is in a palpably false position at such moments. All the same, I remembered by contrast other kisses that were coming my way just then. I also noticed that Mun had not kissed Vi at all. He had not touched her in any way, except to put the small ring on her stick-like finger. The rain had eased off when we emerged, so I suppose it may all have taken rather longer than I supposed. To my relief, there was no further celebration. Even drinks all round at the hotel opposite were precluded by the licensing hours, as we all had to agree. Mun, the new Mrs. Mun, and I re-entered the car, and the Pells waved us away. I saw their squat shapes shoulder to shoulder on the pavement, Mr. Pell with his right arm raised, Mrs. Pell with her left. The rain was now only a light drizzle, to which the Pells seemed impervious. After all, most funerals take place in the wet, I reflected. Could it have been really so difficult for Pell to get away thus briefly and thus early on another day than Saturday? Not that it mattered. I remembered that the Pells had to travel from somewhere or other. I do not think I then knew where Pell plied his profession. Visibly, as I had seen for myself, happier than any lark, as are all these men of timber and satin. Mun was taking his bride back to the rooms over the post office. I had found them, of course, to be more spacious than I had thought before I entered them. I noticed that the word honeymoon was never, in my hearing, mentioned. In the car, however, Vi, from the back seat, did assure me anxiously that, as Mun had said, her father was going to build them a home. "The first thing we'll do," she grated on, "is start looking for a plot. It'll have to be the cheapest we can find, as Daddy doesn't believe in buying things when he can make so much with his own hands." There was no reference to Mun making any contribution, nor did he, installed in the back seat beside her, say a word. "It will only be a teeny house," Vi explained in her rasping voice, "but Mummy says you're often best off when you're living small." It was necessary to enter into it. "Have you a builder in mind?" I inquired. "Of course not, silly. Daddy's going to build it for us." I had sensed that this was in the background. "The whole thing?" I asked. "The plumbing included, and the electricity?" The latter had just entered our area, but was not yet truthfully in our immediate range. "We shan't be having silly things like that. Only wood." I was constrained to turn in my seat, difficult though it was to do, and look back at her. "Daddy can make everything needed in this world out of wood." There was something almost evangelical in her tone and choice of words. There was also something wild and fantastical which seemed infectious. "Even people?" I asked, smiling no doubt, but really asking under some compulsion that remained elusive. "You're making game of me," she replied on the instant. Her pink cheeks had darkened, and I noticed that she, for her part, was not smiling at all. "Lay off, you fool," said Mun, really quite sharply, and speaking almost for the first time since entering the car. "Let's change the subject. We haven't even started looking for the land as yet." "That's right," said Vi, "though we're going to, aren't we, Leonard?" She left little doubt that they were. And we did manage to talk of something else. As a matter of fact, we talked of how beautiful the wedding had been. A compulsory theme, needless to say, for all such moments of time, regardless of objectivity. Mun had been preposterously rude, but I had observed such quick gripings of rage in him before, notably when he thought about the Inland Revenue and how they had treated him. A few weeks later, the Munns did invite me round one evening after supper. It was a remarkably formal visit. I must acknowledge that I found it difficult to keep the word wooden out of my mind. Munn's capacity to talk at large about this and that seemed entirely to have shrivelled, as happened so often to a man after marriage, sometimes immediately after, and Vi's sole interest appeared to be her own family and their conversationally equivocal trade. Inevitably, no doubt, she took the line that there was nothing whatever to be frightened about, and that the details were most interesting when encountered from the inside. The expression, "from the inside," did not appeal to me. And with Vi, it was difficult even to make a feeble joke about it, or I thought about anything. Inevitably, no doubt, she took the line that there was nothing whatever to be frightened about, and that I learned that the constructions in which her father took so much pride, and she on his behalf, were passed off, at least within the family firm, as boxes. It was not that this usage was specially defined to me. It was simply that the words box and boxes, with various other special expressions, were lightly thrown about by Vi, and sometimes by Munn too, so that I quickly realized what was meant, as when one grasps a foreign idiom through contact with those to whom it is habitual. Thus Vi remarked, "Daddy's already made our boxes," as one might lightly describe the planting of 2 saplings by way of commemoration. It was impossible not to perceive that Munn seemed already to be completely involved, to be seriously and sincerely interested in that gruesome business. Again, it is something one commonly notes, that very speedily the husband is all but totally inglutinated into the wife's life pattern. Perhaps, in the present case, a kind of clue was offered, or re-offered. "As soon as I set eyes on those daffies Leonard made," observed Vi, her round blue eyes almost alive, "I knew." And this time, suddenly, I knew too. Munn's reference to something of the same kind, when he was asking me to be his best man, had left me groping about, scroping after some mere folksiness, some rural witchery and magic, which one could only hope was white. Now I realized that, at least for Vi, Munn's journeyman imitations of men, if I may cite Hamlet, were surrogates for those other imitations of men that were put into her father's boxes. For what, at the end, is man but ravelled straw? Munn's cups and plates, or Mrs. Hextable's, had all disappeared, and we ate little square sandwiches with pink stuff inside off smooth wooden platters, and drank tea out of mugs that had not been thrown, but hollowed out. In the end, when Vi was out of the room, Munn offered me whisky, and whipped out a single glass tumbler from the back of the cupboard. He drank nothing himself, though before he had customarily exceeded me. "I've been looking around," he said in a confidential voice. "The daffies won't keep 2 of us, nor will my measly blood money." It struck me that it was the first time that evening he had referred, even indirectly, to the King Charles's head, which previously had floated at almost all times before his angry gaze. "Then soon there will be 3 of us." "Indeed," I replied. I reflected in a vulgar way that it seemed quick work. "I congratulate you both." "Vi sets great store by our having a child immediately, and so do her people." "I see what you mean," I said. "And have you found anything?" "No, damn it, I haven't. It's not easy at our age, but I have something in the back of my mind." "And what is that? If you wish to tell me, of course." "Not just yet, old man." I could hear Vi approaching from the next room. "Only if it materializes." The door opened. "If what materializes, Leonard?" inquired Vi, in her unpleasant voice, her head on one side, like the head of a toy bird. "If Marley's ghost materializes," said Munn, with more authority than I had observed in him during the whole of the earlier evening. Vi projected her straight red tongue at him from her round red mouth. "All things come to him who waits," said Munn with apparent vagueness. Married couples quickly learn to fill in with such utterances. But I never really liked drinking alone, so I soon made my excuses and walked home to my cottage on the outskirts of the community. I had a strong suspicion of what the something was at the back of Munn's mind, and soon we walked into one another outside of the branch banks. Not that either of us ran an account there. If one knows one's onions, one does not bank in one's own gossipy village. "We're off," Munn said, "Vi and I. Next week, in fact. Wednesday, I'm told. The old man's sending one of his wagons. It's the only day he can spare one." Wagons in the patois of the Pell family had an implication similar to that of boxers, so that the symbolism behind Munn's remarks seemed greatly too oppressive. But Munn continued the theme. "I doubt whether we shall meet again, you and I." For a moment I could find nothing at all to say, even though words were my trade. Munn eased matters. "Not that I shan't send you a change of address," he said. "Of course I shall." "In that case," I observed, smiling, "I am sure we shall meet. I shall make a point of looking you up." "Don't speak too soon." "You don't know what I shall be doing." "I think I do know. I'm going into the old man's trade." "Yes?" "I'm to serve a quick apprenticeship. To learn from the bottom up, so to speak, and after that there's a partnership offered, so you'll want to know me, so you'll hardly want to know me any more." "Nonsense," I replied as brightly as I could manage. "Not see that charming girl you've discovered for yourself? Miss seeing your child? Not likely. To so many married men one has to say such things. One feels it is the least one can do, and that it is expected." "You're a good chap," said Munn, "but for God's sake don't feel obliged." "Not in the least. I know what I'm doing and what the consequences are." "Oh, bosh," I replied, in the same spirit as before. "You're taking up one of the safest money spinners there is, and I look to enjoy some pickings from the rich man's table." I received a card bearing Munn's new address. It also bore a faint fringe of acorns, from which for the first time I learned the name of the settlement where the Pells did their work, and as it happened I also saw Pell's wagon, an outsized model, looking all the blacker for its bulk, as it bore away such of the trappings as were Munn's, and Munn himself on the seat in front, with the sadly accoutred driver at the other end, and little Vi wedged between them. It was evening at the time, and rapidly sinking into dusk. I reflected that public use of a wagon for such an uncanonical purpose as this might attract adverse comment if done during the hours of full daylight. As for me, at that moment, I too had a particular reason for sliding about inconspicuously. Indeed, I drew far back into a convenient hedge, as the huge wagon sped smoothly by. I did not go after the wagon that week, or the following week, that month, or the following month, that year, or the following year. The place where the Pells had proved to live was a small industrial town built in remote East Anglia as a single entity during the 19th century. Though high ideals lay behind its founding, it had little current reputation for beauty of architecture. Of course, standards change remarkably in such contexts, but at the time I am talking about, the town was represented as a place more to avoid than to visit. Nor did I receive a specific invitation from the Munns. I had not expected one. Indeed, I received no further communication at all from them, not even an undertaker's Christmas card. Some years later, nonetheless, I drifted over, and so acquired some idea of what ultimately became of Munn. By then I had acquired a small second-hand motor, a two-seater, a so-called roadster. For some time I had had a commission to catalogue all the churches in Suffolk. It was no light or brief task, as Suffolk has many churches. Moreover, the prospect of a similar assignment relating to Norfolk was held before me. As far as pleasure went, I should have greatly preferred to travel by train and on foot, which was then perfectly possible, but my employers pressed. I'm not sure that by the end time had been saved, because my second-hand roadster was always breaking down and leaving me helpless, as I have no gift with machines, and no love for them. I acknowledge that for some time I omitted consideration of the town which housed the Pells, and which I had taken to thinking of always in that way. After all, it was agreed that the place had little to offer the connoisseur of beaux-arts, such as was expected to study my careful list. I was even ignoring the district around it, which indeed was still in the main open heath, with few churches and hardly more houses. Now it has been utilized in familiar ways, varying from an open prison to a large mineral development. But in the end, necessity called, and picking a rainy day, I set out. I should have preferred to disguise myself. In the town itself, all went perfectly well, even though the rain inconveniently ceased to fall while I was doing my duty in the church. I recalled that the same had happened during Munn's inauspicious nuptials. The church, paid for entirely from the pocket of the founding industrialist, was splendidly ornate, after the fashion then in the 1920s, deprecated, but now once more respected. The town as a whole duly seemed more of sociological than aesthetic interest, but my obligation was exclusively ecclesiastical, and though as I edged along the streets I kept half an eye open for the name Pell surmounted by plumes or the staring eyes of black horses, I saw nothing of the kind, and in the end even plucked up courage for a coffee and cake in an anomalous tea-shop, half gentlewoman's chintz and half charge hands lincrusta. In those days it was easier to park one's car, though on the other hand one's car could therefore stand out more conspicuously. It was on a low ridge to the south of the town, and as I drove homewards, that I came upon Munn's new abode. Curiously enough, I was deliberately avoiding any kind of main route, and weaving my way through lanes by the use of the map. This was not easy to combine with driving the roadster, but fortunately the lanes carried very little traffic in those days. Possibly there was some finger of fate which pointed my way to the house. I seemed conscious all along of such an element in my relationship with Munn, and what happened next perhaps confirms it. It was hard to believe that it had been necessary to pay money for the plot on which the house stood. The tiny black structure recalled what one had heard of squatters and their rights. It stood on a sandy, scrubby, nondescript waste, like a thrown-away cabin trunk, or perhaps like a house built by the little people, there one day, gone the next. I am sure I should have known at once that it was the house built by Munn's father-in-law for his chicks with his own hands, but as it happened, Vi in her bright colours was at work in the front garden as my open roadster snorted laboriously up the ridge. At the same time, rain began to fall once more, this time heavily. I saw Vi go back into the little house, from the other side of which Munn emerged, already clad in heavy oilskins. I suppose it was natural enough for the frail female to withdraw from the inclement weather and for the stouter male to take her place. But there seemed to be something odd and automatic about it, all the same. Moreover, on the instant 2 flaps opened in the house's single black gable, and a quite life-size wooden cuckoo jumped out, shouting its head off 4 times. I looked at my watch. It was indeed 4 o'clock. It seemed odd to have a clock outside a tiny private house, as if it were a town hall, but there could be no doubt about the hour of day being audible over a wide area. By this time Munn had looked up and seen me seated there, grinding slowly uphill. To speak plainly, I doubt whether if I had been travelling faster I should have stopped, though this may make me sound a cad. With Munn's gaze upon me I had no alternative. Also, I should have to raise the hood, always a lengthy and injurious undertaking. I brought the motor to a standstill. Munn just stood there staring at me, silent and motionless. His clothes had never appeared particularly to fit, as I believe I have indicated, but the oilskins seemed to belong to another and much larger man altogether. Munn held a hoe with a very long handle, but it was hard to see what he was doing with it, or what Vi had been doing before him. I have spoken of a front garden, but when I stopped the car I realized that there was nothing. No cultivation of any kind, but only the sparse and stony heath, no different in front of the house from elsewhere. "Excuse me," I shouted. "I must put on my hood." By now the rain was bucketing down, what people call a cloudburst, though no one knows exactly what that is. Raising the hood was always a fearful ploy, but I dashed at it and did better than usual under the continued pressures of the situation. All the same, the job took a minute or two, so that it became rather noticeable that Munn was not offering to help. When I had adjusted the last screw, car hoods were more elaborately devised in the early days, I realized that Munn was no longer there at all. Obviously, instead of coming to my aid, he had returned to the house for shelter. I think I should almost certainly have proceeded therewith upon my way, though no doubt with qualms. But what happened was that the car refused to start, which was all too customary. I sat there for some time with the downpour beating on the hood. I dare say I fiddled around a bit with the levers and buttons and so forth, but I had little hope in that direction. Then I noticed that the glass in the front window of Munn's house was broken. They were narrow French windows, narrow but a pair of them. And it was not just a matter of the glass being cracked, but of actual black holes. From the whole look of the place, it dawned on me that no one could seriously live there. And yet, without doubt, I had seen both Munn and Mrs. Munn. The former had stared, quite unmistakably, at me for an appreciable period of time. Hitherto I had spent the day, and long before that, beating around the bush in one way and another, precisely in order not to re-encounter these Muns and Pells. It now occurred to me that the tribe of them had perhaps so weighed upon my mind that I was seeing members of it where they were not. The little black house was so exactly what I was both looking for and avoiding that the notion of an hallucination seemed slightly more plausible than it commonly does. I had even heard or read that hallucinations are most likely at just such moments between dark and light as, with the heavily gathering clouds I had lately passed through. Perhaps for reasons such as these, perhaps for obscurer and less resistible reasons, at which I have hinted, I resolved to have a closer look round. I was wearing a motorist's overcoat, substantial even against such weather as this. I climbed down from the car and walked over to the broken windows. There was no hedge, gate, or boundary of any kind. I looked in with some caution through one of the holes in the glass, while the rain from the wide gable above dripped down my neck. Despite the two French doors, there appeared to be only a single room within, stretching from side to side of the house, and with the inside walls painted in the same black as the outside. There were some vague items of litter lying about the floor, but no real furniture that I could see. All the same, I could hear the huge cuckoo clock ticking above my head, and someone, I reflected, had to wind it. Or perhaps not. Perhaps Mr. Pell could make entirely wooden clocks that required no winding. I was not yet exactly frightened, but rather puzzled. I pushed away at both the French windows, but succeeded only in dislodging further portions of glass, which fell to the black floor inside with astonishingly much noise. I half expected the life-size cuckoo upstairs to croak and protest. I imagined that there might be a door at the back of the structure, through which, as I could not help thinking, one got at the works, and little houses and little artefacts made of wood. I walked round in the rain, and such a door there was. This time I dragged it open. It stuck and shrieked, but by now I meant business, and I pulled hard. The first thing I saw inside was a child seated on a shelf with both arms extended. It was presumably clutching something out of sight at each side, and its whole posture suggested strain and effort, but I realized it was a figure in wood of remarkable liveliness. I even managed to extend my hand and touch it. It felt like wood, too. The little house was divided into two chambers by a wooden partition which, painted in the usual black, now confronted me, and against which the child's shelf was set on wooden brackets. This rear chamber was 6 or 8 feet deep. The door I had opened was a large one, and admitted a considerable amount of light, except into the further corners, but there was no window, and the carefully painted, elaborately lifelike figure of the child had been sitting there, it was impossible to guess for how long, in complete darkness. All things considered, it was surprisingly well preserved and spruce. I now saw that its two hands were involved with a system of wires and pulleys which went upwards into the dimness, but was rusty, broken, and drooping. Here were indeed the customary works. I thought it might be an unusually complex scheme for manipulating the marionette that squatted before me, but it then seemed to me more as though it were the child, with its effortful posture, that was designed to do the manipulation. And the child was so shiny and glossy, while all else was so rotten. Quis custodiet custodem? I could not help asking myself. Beneath the shelf was a low door into the main room of the house, this time ajar. I kicked it open, bent myself double, which was not easy in my very heavy coat, and went through. The litter on the floor, not merely dusty and dirty, but damp and fungoid, proved to be mainly pages from a book or a booklet on the collection of taxes. Against the back partition wall to the right of the door, as I looked back at it, was what appeared, after all, to be the ruin of a large, low piece of furniture. It was as dark, as black as everything else, and I had not made it out when I peered in through the French windows at the front. I saw that to the inside of the dwarf-sized door a piece of paper had been pasted. The instructions, one could not help thinking, on how to get the best out of the device.
Daniel, I'm sorry, but you keep me away.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I went back and peered. Instructions, after a kind, indeed they were, written out in ink, and with no punctuation by a hand to me unknown. I read them, and after a considerable pause brought out my church's notebook from my jacket pocket and copied them down. Here is what I wrote. When the man is sawing wood, wait and watch for falling blood. Blood and sawdust are the same in Dame Nature's little game. When the woman's blindly scraping ends the hour for blows and raping within the earth without a sound, that's what makes the world go round. Whatever else you need to know, set the man and woman so. Let them prophesy forever, curse them once and come back never. Obediently I gazed around me. I thought that, before departing, I might as well look more closely at the low piece of crumbling furniture set against the partition wall. There could be no doubt as to what was really there. The piece of crumbling furniture was a pair of old Mr. Pell's boxes, set side by side and crumbling indeed. They had no lids. Perhaps the lids had crumbled quite away. And inside were the remains, respectively, of the late Mr. and Mrs. Munn, in no ordinary state of decomposition, but half merged, in fact much more than half, into the wood from which and to which I was beginning to think we all spring and return, like a pair of Daphnes, the two of them, I thought, Daphne who was changed by Apollo into a tree. Not that the hideous amalgam in those boxes was imperishable, far from that. It was already turning into a woody, crawling wretchedness, damp and primeval-looking, flesh and pulp as one. Daphne! Of what in that wooden house did the name remind me? Then, of course, I remembered. Old Munn's Daffy's. I could only wonder. I made a bolt for it, not looking back, least of all at the little fellow on the shelf, but slamming the door as I ran so that it jammed fast. Believe it or not, I had quite forgotten that my car was broken down. I gave one twirl on the starter, leapt in, and had roared on for at least a mile and a half, before I recollected that by rights I should not be moving or escaping at all. The finger of fate once more I could not but feel. And perhaps the spell was in fact now broken, because only a few weeks later I read in the local weekly that there had been a bad fire one night on the heath, with many sheds and shanties burnt out and several lives lost. In the way of local weeklies, the report concluded by saying that the funerals of the victims would be conducted by Mr. Pell. Happy Halloween, everybody. 'Tis the season.